Hi, this is Steph Mistruk with KillerPHP.com. In this video tutorial, we're going to look at using the select statement inside of a PHP page. If you recall, in a previous video, previous set of videos, we looked at the big four SQL statements: insert, select, update, and delete. So in this video tutorial, we're going to learn how to use the select statement, the select command with PHP so that we can essentially send the command to a MySQL database using a PHP script and then return those results from the MySQL database and display those results in a web page. And subsequent videos, we'll be looking at the other big four SQL commands or the SQL statements within the context of PHP. If you recall from a previous video, here is the code that we use to connect to a MySQL database. I went over this in detail in a previous video, so I won't cover it here. To make our lives a little bit easier, what I've done is in this page, I've added to that code the code necessary to send a query and a select statement to the MySQL database and then to return the results from that query to our PHP page. So what I'm going to do is I've highlighted here the main body of code that's been added to our original script, and I'm going to go over each line and we're going to look at the results. So let's start with the first line here. On line 21, you see I created a variable query and I'm basically adding a select statement to the variable. So I'm not going to go over the select statement because I assume that you've done my previous videos where I explain each of these quite clearly. So let's look at the first thing that's interesting and new here, the MySQL underscore query function. Now this is one of those built-in functions, and we're using the traditional method of connecting and working with MySQL using PHP. As I mentioned before, there are several different methods. This is the original way. This is the way that's most likely going to work for you on any hosting company's servers, so I decided to use this way. Anyhow, so one of the first things we got to look at is the MySQL underscore query function. This basically is a function that has accepts the argument of a query. We could have just put this text in here, but it's just cleaner to do it this way. So it's the argument that it accepts is the query that you want to send to MySQL. So this function essentially does the communicating to the MySQL database. So in this particular example, we're sending the select command or select statement, basically asking MySQL to return all the records from the table called people. I'm going to go over what this variable is for later on, and we'll get to it very quickly, but let's forget it for now. So once we call this function, the MySQL underscore query function, it returns a value, and this value is inserted into the result variable. So what we do then with the result variable is then use that in another function called MySQL underscore fetch underscore array. Here's the variable. Now this is a function that basically takes the results from this function here and then processes the results in a way that we want. And how do we tell the MySQL fetch array function to process the results? We tell it using the second argument. Now this is a constant. This is basically a keyword for PHP within this function, for this function. It tells it basically, this command basically tells this function here to format the results from the query, right? This is the query, and into an associative array. That's why it's called MySQL SOAKs or a SOC, depending on I guess, on how you want to read it. Anyway, so this is the first argument, which is the result of a query, and we got that from this, right? And this is the second argument of the function, and this is the function I'm talking about. And in this argument here, it's basically a constant, a command, where we're saying return the results and format the results as an associative array. If you think back to my basic lessons on associative arrays, you'll remember how I said that associative arrays and arrays in general are very, very important in terms of your programming work in general and your PHP work as well. We saw how associative arrays were used in processing forms and was used in sessions, and now we see again where we're using arrays, and in this case associative arrays, to work with a MySQL database. So we're basically saying using the MySQL fetch array function to transform the results into an associative array, which we put into this variable here, this new variable called row. And this, of course, is all inserted inside of a while function because we're essentially processing an array. So what I've done here is on this line, inside of the loop, I'm basically populating this myRows variable that I created over here with some text. Here's some text, right? You know it's text as we're inside of quotes, and values from our associative array. So row, row, and you recall the associative array syntax or format. So we're calling row called name. Then we're adding a bunch of text, and then we're calling row called ID, and then we're inserting rather a couple of breaks. So we put this in a while loop. So basically, PHP runs through all the data that we fetch from this query, and then this function here transforms the results of the query into an associative array and places that associative array into this row variable. And then we basically use, inside the while loop, we basically process the associative array as we know how. Once that's done, we close the connection. So let's scroll down a little bit here. So as you know, I hope anyway, as you can see, this myRows variable is now populated with all this data, right? And we then echo out the data. Basically, this is just a long string. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen this format before. This is basically the syntax that you use in PHP to keep adding more and more data into a single variable, and that's what this does. Anyhow, so we scroll down here. Within the actual body of our web page, we echo out the values of myRows. So here you go. I've launched the browser, and let me shorten this up so you can see everything. As you can see, we have our name, Stefan, the ID, our name, Nick, the ID 2, and so on. Let's take a look at our code inside of our while loop, and you can get an idea of what's going on here. So let's pay attention to this, consider this format. And if we go back to our code, so we have name, then we go break, ID, and then we go double break. But you know what we can do? Let's put in an old school horizontal rule, which will make all the web standard zealots crazy. But and there we go. You see how we've now inserted a horizontal rule in between the name and the ID. So we go back here, right? We got our name, horizontal rule, and ID. What makes better sense to me, actually, is to insert it after each loop. So let's refresh that page again. There we go. So name, ID, horizontal rule. So you get the idea how we're able to build a page of text. Actually, let's look at the source code, view source. So you notice how we build a page of text here using PHP. I want to point out a couple quick little things for you. If you notice, all my PHP code is in the head of the page so that it's not mixed in with our actual body code here. It's good to keep PHP code separate from where you're going to have your actual HTML. So I put in a header. Just to give you an idea, you notice how there's so little PHP code that's nice and clean, it's safe. And it makes, you'll see later on down the road when you're building more and more PHP pages, it's good to keep your PHP outside of the actual pages that people will see when you're browsing your websites. More on that later, but just keep in mind, you want to keep your PHP separate from your HTML as much as possible. That's a general rule we like to keep in mind when we're doing our work. So I'm guessing that some of you may be wanting to see how you can take results from a query and how you can put them into an HTML table. So again, through the power of cheating, I've done it here. So, well, power of cheating, basically when I shut down the video and I wrote it out so that you didn't have to watch me type it all out. Anyhow, so I've just commented out our very first set of, our first set of text here. And what I've done here is I just use table code instead. It's the same type of thing. I'm just writing out table code and I'm calling the associative array values as I did before, except this time they're wrapped in table rows. You notice there's no table tags here. This is my strategy, and you'll see why a little later. But if we scroll down now, and you see how I've created the table itself down here, and I've echoed out the rows in here. And the reason I do this way, as opposed to maybe, creating a variable and putting the table code in here, is that this way a web designer could go in there and make changes to the table code without having to go into the PHP. This may not seem like a big deal to you now because all the PHP database stuff is in the same page that we actually see the table being built. But what you want to do eventually is you want to take this out, extract it out into its own separate page, so you would only have an include statement, and you'd only have this line of PHP code as well. It just keeps it clean. I'll show you that in a second, but let's just take a look at the table, how it's rendered. No big deal. Again, very simple, but as you can see, we've rendered a table using PHP and using records derived from a MySQL database. So the next thing I want to look at is extracting all this PHP code and removing it from the page that people actually see when they come visit your site. So let's compare this. So what I've done is I created a database -connect -include inc.php page. So this page has only our database code in it, as you can see, no HTML code at all. And it does everything as we've seen before, except it's just the PHP code. So now if we look at this new page that people see, now what we have here is an include statement, and we're basically including this PHP code in our page, and then we're just echoing out the rows straight to the page. So what's really cool about that, as you notice, you can have your designer design all kinds of stuff, and they don't have to worry about fudging up all your PHP code. So you keep it nice and clean and nice and separate this way rather. And the page will work as we saw before, except just everything is extracted. This is, let me stress, this is one of the goals of writing clean web application code, whether it be PHP or ASP.NET or what have you, is you want to try to keep your PHP code, your programming code, out of the web pages. Now, the pages that people actually see when they visit your site. In the nerd world, they call these pages the view pages, as in the pages that people view. So I'm going to start using that terminology a little bit more. So keep in mind that in your view pages, you want to minimize as much as possible the intermingling of PHP with your HTML and CSS. And you also want to minimize the amount of code, PHP code itself, that you have in your view pages. So in this case, I just extracted everything and put it in a database connect page. What's also cool about this, I could reuse this on many different pages. Just keep in mind, this is not the pinnacle of page and PHP design. This is very simple for simple projects. And also I wanted to keep it simple since you're learning this stuff for the first time. But what you got to take away from this, first of all, is how we do it in the first place, how we connect, and how we use these two key functions to, and along with the while loop, to basically to extract information from the database. And you also take from this also the fact that it's a very good idea to try to keep your PHP code as far away as possible from your HTML. This will help you with maintenance of their site, will help you in terms of keeping up to date, will help you with building it, will help you if you're working with another designer. So you're not going to be, much less chance he can bust your code if all the PHP code is in separate files that he doesn't touch, or he or she doesn't touch rather. So yeah, there you go. So those are the two things you got to pay attention to. In other videos, I'll get into the other big SQL statements as I discussed before. And you see it works pretty much the same way with some subtle differences depending on the particular SQL statement. I hope you enjoyed the video. My name is Stefan Mischuk with KillerPHP.com and KillerSites.com.